For some reason, no matter where we find Africans, Egyptologists and other historians seem to insist that they're sectioned off. A good example of this is the sub Saharan African word or phrase that says that Africans did not go to North Africa and they do not represent the people of North Africa. Well, I've dismantled this argument like a million times. I have no problem using the word sub Saharan Africa because it's just a region. But I have a problem with them using this region to determine a race. It is true that today the majority of people who live in the sub Saharan region are black. And it is true that the majority of people who live in North Africa would be mixed. But again, using this theory or using this statement that they make up of sub Saharan Africa, they then shift it as well. They have these gates just locked in sub Saharan Africa that we cannot cross. But you go to Egypt, and there's several writers that write about seeing Egyptians that are Ethiopian or are dark skinned, and their excuse again becomes there's a gate. There's something locking these black Africans for thousands of years from crossing over to the northern parts of Egypt. But I'm also here to say that you can't just stand on a theory that you made up about people staying behind a gate in Elephantine forever. At some point, you're going to have to accept that you're making it up. And looking at images of Egyptians, it's quite obvious that it's made up. A quick question: what's a black person? You know, something I always ask myself is when these people say ancient Egyptians are mixed race, do they mean they look like this? Or do they mean they look like this? A lot of the time, this word mixed race is just another way of saying white person, which is why they always say they're mixed, and you can tell because the men are tanned. Now, I want to ask you guys a question. This is a very serious question. What population do you know on Earth where the men and the women look like they don't belong to the same race? Whether they're mixed or not, if you go to any population in the world, you will notice that the men are the same complexion as the women. In some instances, the women, especially in Western or whatever, they will look different because they'll spray tan or do some other thing, some other physical thing that will change the way they look. But in real life, if you go look anywhere in the world, the complexion of the people will always match between the men and the women. The hair will match, the faces will match, the body will match. And also, I want to know something. Why is it that if the people of Elephantine are the Ethiopians, and then the people of Abu or the people of the northern parts of Egypt, if they are not Egyptian in the same way that the people of the south are, then why don't they show that in their art? Why isn't there a clear thing like, okay, if you go to the south, all of them are black? Why is it that every time we see dark skinned Nubians, they always say they're Nubians from further south outside of Egypt? Does this make any sense to anybody? If we look at the ancient Egyptians portraying other people, it is true that they see themselves as slightly lighter skinned than the Nubians, but then they see themselves a whole lot darker skinned than the Arabs. And you can see if we look at the story of Senehi that over here it said, I heard the sound of lowing of cattle and sighted Syrians. In other words, he could tell what a Syrian looked like Just from his eyes, he looked at them and he saw that this guy is Assyrian. If you look at Assyrian today and you look at an Egyptian today, outside of the very dark ones, outside of the very dark Egyptians, you could not say who's Syrian and who's not. But this guy could spot them with his eyes alone, telling you these people do not look the same. Also, they say I was spied out by one of their scouts who had been in Egypt, meaning that someone was like, oh my God, I can see it. That person is an Egyptian, possibly even knowing exactly who he is. In fact, according to the story, he knew exactly who he was. So it's obvious that by this description alone, we can tell that they know the difference physically. And in fact, they assume that the reader knows the difference between an Egyptian and a Syrian physically. Now, I want to emphasize the majority of images that you see, the ones depicting the different races, the majority of those images are made during wartime, meaning that the differences between the races are exaggerated more than they would in normal. But if you look at these Nubians who bring gifts to the Egyptian, their skin color is no longer portrayed with this dark, like you guys are so black, we can't believe it. Instead, they're depicted with the same typical red that you see in Egypt, uh, with a little maybe instant giveaways that they are Nubian, like the clothing. The hair of the one of these people is typical in Egypt, so that doesn't matter. Their long limbs as well might be a different thing. But if you look, they bring a giraffe from further south and they've tied it up. This is a beautiful image. This image depicts some warriors going to war. The man in the back is sometimes referred to by Egyptologists as a Nubian, probably because his hair is a dead giveaway of African features, even though all of these people have dead giveaway of African features. But if he is a Nubian, if we take that statement to heart, then we have to check and look and say, well, his skin color isn't that much different than these Egyptians. Is it because he's working with them that they portray him so flatteringly? Or is it just another Egyptian who is being distinguished because his job is not a warrior? Is seeing a Nubian in this image just another way of trying to differentiate Egyptians from other black people? Because of course, if you look at his hair, that there's no way you're gonna say that's a wig. Although I would say the soldiers as well aren't wearing a wig, because why the hell would you wear a wig and go to war? That's dumb. Also, the idea that men used to generally wear wigs in the past is silly.